Imagine being minutes away from lethal injection. The needle already prepared, the witnesses already seated, your final meal already eaten. When someone finally decides to look at evidence that's been sitting in a folder for over a decade. Evidence that proves you're innocent. Evidence that shows the real killer confessed years ago, but nobody bothered to listen. Imagine spending 14 years on death row watching 54 men walk past your cell to their executions, knowing you're supposed to be next, all while the truth sits buried in a file cabinet that nobody wants to open. This is what happened to Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin, a man Florida sentenced to die for murders he didn't commit, murders that someone else admitted to committing, murders where the blood evidence, the timeline, and basic common sense all screamed his innocence. But none of that mattered. Because once the state decides you're guilty, the truth becomes an inconvenience they'd rather ignore. Clemente went to sleep one night as a young man with his whole life ahead of him. He woke up 14 years later, his youth stolen, his faith shattered, having survived one of the cruelest injustices imaginable, being condemned to death while holding the key to his own innocence that nobody would use. Tonight, you're about to hear a story so enraging, so incomprehensible, that it will make you question everything you believe about the justice system. A story about how Florida nearly executed an innocent man even after the real killer confessed. How prosecutors fought to keep that confession hidden. And how Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin survived 14 years in hell because one lawyer refused to stop digging. Stay with me because what happened to Clemente will haunt you. And what it reveals about how far the system will go to avoid admitting a mistake will terrify you. June 13, 2004. Seminole County, Florida. A quiet mobile home park in a working-class neighborhood. Inside one mobile home, two people lay dead. Carol Barres, age 61, and her daughter Cheryl Williams, age 38. Both had been stabbed multiple times. The scene was horrific. Blood everywhere. Signs of a brutal, frenzied attack. Whoever did this was either in a rage or completely out of control. The bodies were discovered by Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin, a 26-year-old Venezuelan immigrant who lived in the mobile home right next door with his girlfriend. Clemente had noticed he hadn't seen Carol or Cheryl in a couple of days, which was unusual. Carol was disabled and usually needed help. So that morning, Clemente walked over to check on them. The door was unlocked. He stepped inside, and he walked into a nightmare. Blood. So much blood. Carol was on the floor. Cheryl was in the bedroom. Both clearly dead and had been for days. Clemente panicked. He had never seen anything like this. He ran outside, found a neighbor, and told them to call 911. Then he waited, shaking, trying to process what he'd just seen. When the police arrived, Clemente told them everything. He explained he was the neighbor, that he'd found the bodies, that he'd touched nothing except the door. But the moment police saw blood on Clemente's shoes, blood he'd stepped in when he entered the crime scene, their investigation stopped. They didn't look for other suspects. They didn't consider other possibilities. They looked at Clemente, a young immigrant with broken English, and decided. He did it. Within hours, Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He kept telling them he didn't do it, that he just found the bodies, that he was trying to help. But nobody was listening, because the police had their suspect. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed, because the real killer was still out there, and he was about to confess. Sammy Williams, Carol Barres' son, Cheryl Williams' brother. A violent, unstable man with a long history of drug abuse and explosive behavior. Sammy lived in the same mobile home park, just a few units away from his mother and sister. And Sammy had a massive problem with them. They owed him money. He was angry. And in the days before the murders, neighbors heard him threatening them. But when police questioned Sammy, he played the grieving son. Said he had no idea what happened. That he was devastated. And the police, already convinced Clemente was guilty, didn't push. Here's the thing though. Sammy couldn't keep his mouth shut. While Clemente sat in jail awaiting trial, Sammy started telling people what really happened. He told cellmates. He told other inmates. He even told a detective. He described the murders in detail. He said he went to his mother's trailer. They fought about money. He lost control. He stabbed them both. And then he left. Multiple people heard Sammy confess to the murders. Multiple people reported it. But prosecutors buried it. They didn't want to hear it. Because if Sammy was the killer, then Clemente was innocent. And they'd already built their case. They'd already told the community they caught the murderer. Admitting they were wrong wasn't an option. So they hid Sammy's confessions. And they prosecuted Clemente anyway. The trial was a disaster. The entire case against Clemente was built on the blood on his shoes and the fact that he was the one who found the bodies. That was it. No motive. No murder weapon. No witnesses. No physical evidence tying him to the actual crime. Just blood on his shoes from walking into the crime scene. The prosecution told the jury that Clemente killed Carol and Cheryl in a robbery gone wrong. But they couldn't explain what was stolen. They couldn't explain why Clemente would call 911 and wait for police if he was the killer. They couldn't explain why a man with no history of violence would suddenly commit a brutal double murder. None of it made sense. But the prosecution had something powerful: the victim's surviving family. Sammy Williams sat in the courtroom, playing the devastated son, the grieving brother. He cried. He hugged the victim's friends. And he watched as Clemente was convicted of murdering his mother and sister, the murders Sammy himself committed. The jury deliberated, and they came back with a verdict: guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Then came the penalty phase. In Florida, a first-degree murder conviction can result in either life in prison or the death penalty. The prosecution asked for death. They painted Clemente as a monster, a cold-blooded killer, someone who deserved to die. The jury agreed. Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin was sentenced to death. He was 27 years old. He spoke broken English. He had no criminal record. He had simply tried to help his neighbors. And now the state of Florida was going to execute him. Clemente was sent to Florida State Prison, to death row. Union Correctional Institution. One of the most brutal death rows in America. He was placed in a 6 by 9 foot cell alone for 23 hours a day. His only view was concrete walls and a small window to the hallway where guards walked past. Death row is not designed for rehabilitation. It's designed to warehouse people until the state is ready to kill them. And Florida's death row moves fast. Clemente watched as men around him were executed. One after another after another. 54 men walked past his cell to the execution chamber during the time he was there. 54 men who entered the death watch cell, ate their last meal, said their final words and never came back. Clemente lived with the knowledge that he was next. That one day the guards would come for him. That he would take that same walk. That he would be strapped to a gurney and injected with chemicals that would stop his heart. 4 murders he didn't commit. But Clemente never stopped insisting he was innocent. He wrote letters. He filed appeals. He begged anyone who would listen to look at the evidence. And most importantly, he begged them to look at Sammy Williams. Because Sammy had confessed. Multiple times. To multiple people. But the state of Florida didn't care. They had their conviction. They had their death sentence. And they intended to carry it out. Then in 2016, the case reached a lawyer named Maria de Liberato with the Office of Capital Collateral Regional Counsel. Maria started digging into Clemente's case, and what she found horrified her. Sammy Williams had confessed to the murders. Not once. Not twice. Multiple times. He confessed to inmates. He confessed in letters. He even confessed to a detective, saying, "I killed my mother and sister. I did it. Not that Spanish guy." And prosecutors knew. They had the confessions. They had witness statements. And they buried them. They never turned them over to Clemente's defense team. They hid evidence that could have proven his innocence. Maria also discovered something else. The blood evidence didn't match the prosecution's timeline. The medical examiner determined that Carol and Cheryl had been dead for at least 2 days before Clemente found them. But Clemente had been seen by multiple witnesses during that time, nowhere near the crime scene. The timeline didn't work. The blood spatter didn't work. Nothing worked. Unless you considered that Sammy Williams was the killer. Maria filed motion after motion. She presented the confessions. She presented the timeline. She presented expert testimony showing the blood evidence proved Clemente's innocence. and the state of Florida fought her every step of the way. They argued that Sammy's confessions were unreliable, that he was just bragging, that Clemente was still guilty. They fought to keep an innocent man on death row rather than admit they'd made a mistake. The case went to the Florida Supreme Court. In 2016, the court looked at the evidence and came to a stunning conclusion. Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin's conviction was based on false evidence and prosecutorial misconduct. They overturned his death sentence and ordered a new trial. But the state still wouldn't let him go. They decided to retry him. Even though Sammy had confessed, even though the evidence proved Clemente's innocence, they were going to try to convict him again. The retrial took 2 more years. 2 more years of Clemente sitting in prison, not on death row anymore but still locked up, still fighting for his freedom. His lawyers presented all the evidence. Sammy's confessions, the blood timeline, the lack of motive, everything. And finally, in 2018, the prosecution gave up. They couldn't win. The evidence was overwhelming. On May 13, 2018, the state of Florida dismissed all charges against Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin. After 14 years, Clemente walked out of prison a free man. He was 40 years old. He'd gone in at 26. He'd lost his 20s and most of his 30s. He'd survived 14 years on death row for murders he didn't commit. Murders that the real killer confessed to. Murders that basic evidence proved he couldn't have committed. When Clemente walked out of prison, he didn't know how to function in the outside world. 14 years of isolation, of living in a cage, of believing every day might be his last. That doesn't just disappear. He had PTSD. He had nightmares. He struggled to trust people. He struggled to believe he was actually free. The state of Florida gave him $2 million in compensation. $2 million for 14 years on death row. That works out to about $143,000 per year. About $390 per day. About $16 per hour. That's what Florida decided his freedom was worth. But no amount of money gives you back 14 years. No amount of money erases the trauma of watching 54 men walk to their deaths, knowing you were supposed to be next. No amount of money brings back your 20s and 30s, your youth, your life. And Sammy Williams, the real killer, the man who confessed multiple times, he was never charged. He's still free, walking around, living his life, while Clemente spent 14 years in hell for crimes Sammy committed. That's the injustice. The real murderer got away with it, and an innocent man nearly died. Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin's story is one of the most infuriating cases of wrongful conviction in modern American history. Not just because he was innocent, but because the evidence proving his innocence was available the entire time. The real killer confessed. The timeline didn't match. The blood evidence didn't match. Everything pointed to his innocence. But the system didn't care. Prosecutors cared more about protecting their conviction than protecting the truth. They hid evidence. They ignored confessions. They fought for years to keep an innocent man on death row rather than admit they were wrong. And they nearly succeeded. If Maria de Liberato hadn't fought so hard, if the Florida Supreme Court hadn't finally listened, if the evidence hadn't been so overwhelming that even the prosecutors couldn't deny it anymore, Clemente would be dead, executed, gone, for murders he didn't commit. This case exposes something terrifying about the death penalty. It's not just that innocent people can be convicted. It's that even when their innocence is proven, even when the real killer confesses, the system will fight to kill them anyway. Because admitting a mistake is worse in their eyes than executing an innocent person. Clemente is free now. He's trying to rebuild his life. He's advocating for criminal justice reform. He's speaking out against the death penalty. He's trying to make sure what happened to him doesn't happen to anyone else. But he carries the weight of those 14 years every single day. The faces of the 54 men who were executed while he was there. The sound of the death chamber door closing. The fear of knowing he was supposed to be next. That doesn't go away. And his mother, who fought for him every single day, who never stopped believing in his innocence, who visited him on death row as often as she was allowed. She died while he was still in prison. She never got to see him walk free. That's another thing money can't fix. This is the story of Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin, a man who spent 14 years on death row while the real killer confessed. A man who survived one of the cruelest injustices imaginable. A man who should have been executed, would have been executed, if not for one lawyer who refused to give up. He lost 14 years. His 20s, his 30s, his youth, his freedom, his mother. All because Florida decided he was guilty and refused to consider that they might be wrong. Remember his name. Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin. An innocent man who came within inches of being executed. A man who survived because the truth, eventually, couldn't be buried anymore. And remember this, if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. Because the system that almost killed Clemente is still out there. Still convicting. Still sentencing. Still executing. And the question that haunts every death row case is this: how many others are still there, still waiting, still screaming their innocence, while the truth sits in a folder nobody wants to open?